As we get started, I will invite everyone joining to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let people know who you are and where you're dialing in, zooming in from this morning, so that we can invite you to use the chat for active dialogue with each other and to react to the insights that we're hearing from our special guest. And then we'll use the Q&A function for questions, and we'll give people just one more minute to join. And yes, that is indeed a Miriam McMaster image that we'll be introducing shortly. Welcome, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started. And as people can see, we've got guests filing in from across Canada and around the world in our terrific family medicine community to join our New Horizons speaker series this morning. Welcome, everyone. Please do take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're zooming in from this morning. And we're going to get started. It's 8:02. Welcome everyone to this 8th conversation in our New Horizons series. My name is Danielle Martin. I'm a family doctor in Toronto, and I'm the chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine here at the University of Toronto. I'm so excited and delighted to see so many people registered today coming from across our Faculty of Medicine and indeed across the province and around the world. And before I welcome today's speaker, I just want to say a couple of words about the purpose of this series and about the wonderful image that you see on the screen, which we have permission to use as the background art for our series. And I'll invite the next slide, please. So New Horizons, this speaker series is all about dreaming big about the future of family medicine and primary care and our academic department. And this is really an acknowledgement that if we want to make real change in our health system, and a healthier society, we need to challenge ourselves to reevaluate our assumptions and to draw fresh perspectives from sometimes less obvious places, whether that's the arts, public health, community activism, social sciences, and more. And so it's my hope as chair of the department in founding this series that the fresh perspectives that are brought to us by these wonderful colleagues will help us to challenge our thinking. This image that you see is a wonderful work of art by Miriam McMaster, a Canadian artist with Plains, Cree, British, and Dutch ancestry. And it's entitled Lead Me to Places I Could Never Find on My Own. It's the second of a two-part series that when I first saw it, I was so moved by it. And the title of the image really spoke to me about the purpose of this series. It's from a series called As Immense as the Sky. And thank you to the faculty members who told me that they, having seen this image at a prior series, took the time to go out to the McMichael Gallery to see Meryl's spectacular exhibit over the last couple of months. It's always a rejuvenating thing to do a visit to the McMichael if you haven't had a chance to go. And I'd like to read to you a little bit about this piece as a way of centering and situating ourselves not only on the land, but in the wisdom of our Indigenous colleagues. Meryl says about this image, stories of the constellations have been passed down over generations within both Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures. Humans and animals have used the stars to navigate for thousands of years and still do so to this day. As the stars become hidden by light pollution, and not just light pollution, but today smoke, we start to lose our way. This image was taken at the Badlands in Grasslands National Park, which is a dark sky preserve, and perched atop her hat in the image are indigo bunting birds who use the stars to navigate. She says, carrying the universe, they lead me to the stars as I seek answers in the sky. So for this series, I hope that we can draw on many different traditions of navigation and chart our own way, not just as a department, but as a discipline. With that, I want to welcome our very special guest today, Sarah Polley, a Canadian actor, director, writer, producer, and now Oscar winner. Congratulations, Sarah, on your Academy Award. Quite a spectacular achievement. And I'll just say that in addition to the winning of the award itself, those of us who follow you on social media quite enjoyed the April Fool's joke that your child played on you, in which you were informed that the Academy had made a mistake and was taking the Oscar back. After making short films, Sarah made her feature-length directorial debut with Away from Her in 2006 and received an Oscar nomination for the screenplay, which she adapted from Alice Munro's The Bear Came Over the Mountain. Her other projects include the documentary Stories We Tell, which is an incredible documentary, the miniseries adaptation of Margaret Atwood's novel Alias Grace, and the romantic comedy Take This Waltz, just to name a few of her tremendous projects. Next slide, please. And one of the reasons why we're so lucky to have Sarah with us today is, of course, earlier this year, she won the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Women Talking, which is adapted from the Miriam Toews novel of the same name and inspired by true events. And if you haven't seen this film, I have to say, it is the most incredible, moving film I have seen, not just in the last year, but for as long as I can remember. I was completely blown away by it. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing this film to all of us. Of course, she is also the author of Run Towards the Danger, a collection of essays about her own life, exploring the fallibility of memory, the mutability of reality in the mind, and the possibility of experiencing the past in new ways, as the person you are now, but were not then. And it's a terrific book. I gobbled it up, and we have purchased 50 copies of Run Towards the Danger, which were given out to the first 50 registrants to this rounds talk this morning. And if you don't have a copy of Run Towards the Danger, I really recommend it. It's a great book. So we're going to cut the slides now. And I'm just going to remind everyone, please do use the chat liberally to interact with one another. But if you have a question for Sarah, please put it in the Q&A function. I'm going to interview her a little bit and for maybe about 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to cut to Q&A from the audience. So feel free to ask questions about family medicine, the arts, and anything else that you want to hear from Sarah. Welcome, Sarah Polley.
Thank you for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
And just to start out, I want to say, you know, among the many things that give you tremendous star power, your sister is a family doctor. So that's fantastic. We're so happy to have you in our family medicine community this morning. One of the things I was hoping we could start with is to talk about your film, Women Talking. And we're thinking about this image of these women. I won't spoil the film for anyone. You don't need to worry, folks. It's not the kind of movie that really can be spoiled in that way. The action that is happening on the screen is mostly conversation. And it is referring to all kinds of things that one might think of as being the kind of central plot where horrible abuse is taking place, almost none of which happens on screen. It's all off screen. And it made me think about family medicine and the ways in which our offices are places where people come to talk about events that are not happening in front of us. And people are interpreting their version of those events, their experience of those events, through filtering them through their own experiences. And we as family physicians are witnessing indirectly. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the parallels there and how you made the decisions around not, for example, showing the violence that the film refers to in a direct way, and just speak around that theme.
Yeah, so that was something I decided really early in the process, was that, you know, these women have gathered in a hayloft to decide the future of their community in the wake of these terrible assaults that have happened over years to most of the women. And they're deciding whether or not to stay in their community and do nothing and forgive the men, if they're going to stay and fight, or if they're going to leave and create a new community. So it's a debate that takes place, just for those of you who haven't seen it, over the course of an hour and a half. And the events that have spurred this conversation and what is referred to constantly is not really shown on screen. And the decision-making around that had to do with a few things. One, I think that seeing sexual assault in a film is rarely additive. I think it's rarely useful, and I think it rarely accomplishes the thing it intends. So I think it's really hard to show it without somehow fetishizing it. I also know for survivors of sexual assault, it can be extremely difficult to watch. So there was some thinking around that, but also more importantly, I think, is the fact that the way that those events have impacted these women, the way they're processing them, the way they're moving alongside them, the way they remember them, and the way they inform who they are now was far more important than the details of what actually happened. And we see in this community of women a really diverse range of responses. So some of these women are infuriated and enraged and want to fight. And some of these women have gone into a state of almost paralysis and, episodes of PTSD and flashbacks and not being able to move. Some have sort of gone into a sort of state of almost exaggerated and not quite believable equanimity around it, of trying to process. And it really shows the incredible range of responses that people can have. And ultimately, the film tries not to judge any of those responses or better or worse, that every response is valid. So really, it's about how, people are moving alongside these things, not the facts of what's actually happened. Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I do think it's interesting to me, just having been a patient so many times in various scenarios, how what's important in a story is rarely what you think is important when you come in to tell it. And it seems to me that a huge skill, both as a filmmaker and perhaps as a physician, I don't know, would be to find the mechanisms with which to find out what the stories are that may seem unimportant when you come to tell the story that you're there to tell. Like what are the stories that you haven't identified as crucial? So yeah, it was an interesting process to sort of make something about something that you never see, and ultimately have the audience discover it's actually about something much more important, which is, and now what? Now how do we move forward with this? Because I think there's tons of conversation around the Me Too movement about identifying harms, and that's really important work and needs to continue to happen. But what I was left with was a sense of, okay, but now what? Like, now what do we do with all of this? How do we move forward?
And to me, that is so similar to the consultation room. This notion of trying to appreciate people's reactions or experiences, to take them as they are, and then now what? There are like really an interesting number of parallels there. Can you say a little bit about what techniques filmmakers use to make people, whether they're actors or if you're making a documentary, not actors, feel safe telling, bringing the full range of their experiences to a film set? Which, I will say that one of the great privileges of family medicine and of medicine in general is people generally, not always, come prepared to be vulnerable. They're kind of expecting to have to share or coming because they want to share. But I imagine that must be much harder in it, for example, if you're making a documentary. So what are the ways that filmmakers use?
Yeah, so I have a couple of answers to that question. One has to do with making a fictional film like this one, and one would have to do with making documentaries, but I think both are probably relevant in some way. In a fictional film, one of the most useful things that I learned as a filmmaker from an amazing performance consultant named Lindy Davies from Australia was this notion of creating an environment of unconditional positive regard, and that the actors are wrapped in that from the second they walk into the room, that they are not being judged, that they are not being, they're not facing any skepticism, that whatever they do is kind of wrapped in a feeling of a certain amount of acceptance and possibly even love. This idea that you can't do wrong, you can go in a direction that we decide not to go in, but ultimately you're safe. And that's for me, I've taken that on as my main job as a director, that if I take care of that with a cast and crew, probably what I will get out of the end product, even if it's at the cost of putting all that energy into that environment of safety, even if it's at the cost of a million details that I might miss, what I will get unexpectedly from people who feel that way will be very, very worth it, and very worth like investing that and being my main goal. In terms of a documentary, I heard amazing advice, because when I first made my documentary Stories We Tell, I'd never made a documentary. And I was able to be part of this lab with all of these documentary filmmakers developing their films, all of whom were much more experienced than me. And we had tons of mentors come in. So I had years to ask questions. And among the most valuable things I learned was ask the same question on 3 different occasions. That was huge, because the answers are really different. And it's not because people are lying. It's because we're all in movement. We don't always know ourselves. We sometimes have things shift and change. It depends on the day and how vulnerable we feel we can be, or how open or how clearly we're thinking. So that was a huge one for me, is ask the same question 3 times. I did it sometimes within the same interview, if there was enough time between it, or just rephrased it so it didn't feel like the same question. And I got incredible stuff out of people that way. The other thing was, don't fill the silence. So leave that minute, and let that be maybe a little bit uncomfortable, where you've asked a question, someone's answered it. Because usually with silence, what will happen is people don't love silence and they do want to fill it. And often what you get in that silence is either the real answer to the question or an imperative detail that completely changes the context of the story you've heard. So those 2 things for me ended up being, and that was hard because I was interviewing my family, and there's no place where you want to interrupt someone more than when someone's telling, a story about your shared life that you don't agree with. Like, it's so easy to jump in and to have to sit back. I was able to learn things about my family history I would have never known if I hadn't had this policy of forcing myself to shut up. So that's been a really interesting thing. I recognize that in a family physician's office, you have so little time. But yeah, those are some of the things I was thinking about last night in the context that I thought may in some way be relevant. I'm not sure.
I think it's highly relevant. And but David White's just summarized those pearls in the chat. I think we should all think about whether we're as true as we wish we were to those pearls in our clinical practices every day. And just one more question on that. What are some of the concrete ways that one creates that environment of unconditional positive regard? And are there ways in a family doctor's office or in a practice, the way that we organize our systems and practices more broadly, that you think, as a person who, as you say, has been a patient many times, and you would detail some of your experiences in the book, what does that unconditional positive regard look like and feel like in a medical environment to you?
Sure. The first sort of thing that I just flashed on, which I had forgotten until you just talked about this, is I realized the way that I handle stressful situations on set where we're just running out of time, or an actor can't get the time they need from me, or things have to be either rushed or someone has to work overtime, is completely modeled on the way a NICU nurse handled me when I had a premature baby. I completely modeled the way, I changed completely the way I communicate based on this, which was, my babies, like any NICU mom knows, like your obsession is just like getting the breastfeeding going. And there was this moment where it looked like my first baby was starting to root, and I would have maybe gotten her on, and I was so excited. There was a doctor who was doing his rounds, but there was a baby in crisis that I didn't see, a few rows the right way from me. And the nurse was like, I need the doctor over there now. And I was like, okay, but can you just hand me the baby? And she was like, no, we all need to be there. And I didn't know what was going on. And I was so deeply upset that I was missing this moment. And this woman just put her hands on my shoulders and just very calmly and clearly and confidently said, I know this is terrible. You should be able to breastfeed your baby right now. And I wish I could help you. Everyone needs to be over there right now because that baby's really sick, and I need the doctor over there right now, and I need to be with him. But I realize how hard this is. And then she went. It cost her almost no time. But in that moment, I was acknowledged in terms of how frustrating and upsetting it was. I was told the limits of the resources available at the time in a way that I could understand, and I could be at peace with it. It completely regulated me. So I actually do that in a much more superficial setting. That is sort of, I express how frustrating something is if something isn't going the way it was supposed to go. I validate those feelings. I explain as clearly and as an adult a way I can, as though this is a peer and I'm not a gay. Like, the other thing is not like being the compassionate ally in understanding the frustrations of the resources, and also speaking to one as though you're an adult who can absorb frustrating information and limits. But I think that thing of like separating yourself from being a gatekeeper into like, I understand this is frustrating. Here's what I can do about it. Here's what I can't do about it, has been huge. And I think in terms of the overall kind of unconditional positive regard, I just make it really clear to people that the experience of them working on this film is far more important than the end results. And yeah, I think that bringing as much humor into a work environment has been incredibly important. We set up things on our set, like we had an amazing psychologist who was on set, because some of the subject matter was bringing up a lot of stuff for crew and cast. So we had her available on our difficult days. And I think just people noticing that you're prioritizing their emotional well-being in any given moment is great, even if there's not much you can do about it. Like, that's what I've noticed just being a patient, is it's not always that, someone can get you into a specialist earlier than the 4-month wait it takes. But if someone can express that they're going to do what they can and that they recognize the frustration, I feel like I go away with a kind of equilibrium that's not possible if someone is, being a gatekeeper for, the very starved system.
Yeah, I think that that's a critical insight. And given how much time we're all spending right now having to help our patients come to terms with the limits of what the system can do, I think it's really wise advice. I want to move to another insight from your book that I found incredibly like the parallels to family medicine were so stark for me, and that is this thing of not just waiting, but traveling the journey of an uncertain diagnosis. So you talk in your book about your experience of concussion, and also your experience of endometriosis, and in both instances, it took a long time for you to, in the one case, be diagnosed, and in the other case, find the treatment path that was the right one for you to get better. And which means that you had to sit in uncertainty for a really long time. And one of the things that we do as family doctors is try, sometimes more successfully than others, to help our patients to live in uncertainty. In fact, this is something that we talk about with our learners as one of the core precepts of our discipline, is dealing with uncertainty, early signs of disease, waiting for things to declare themselves or resolve on their own, not moving too quickly, and allowing things to evolve, and working with our patients to sit in the discomfort of uncertainty while the body works stuff out. One of our great poets of family medicine, Iona Heath, has called that patrolling the border between illness and disease, trying not to pull people over that border too quickly. So this experience of uncertainty is something we think about a lot in academic family medicine. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what your experience of uncertainty has been, and where you found that it was dealt with well on your journey, and where you wished it had been dealt with differently, and any insights you have from your own work around uncertainty, which I know is of course huge in your field as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just practically the most useful thing that was ever given to me was a recommendation to go to the NBSR program. So in the middle of both of those diagnoses, when things were hardest, I think having meditation as a practice was absolutely key. And I'm not sure I could have survived some of that without it. Again, I think just, being in a room with someone who's genuinely curious, who's genuinely listening. I think, I have, friends in a situation right now that's been really, really horrible and serious with their kid. And there was a moment recently where a specialist said to them, after, months of confusion, and they met with a specialist who said, tell me your story. I've looked at all the information, I've looked at your charts, but tell me your story. And I think the healing power of someone being able to tell their whole story from beginning to end, even if there's no conclusion, and even if there are all kinds of loose ends and tons of confusion in it, I have found that when I've met with people over the course of the years, like, to be extraordinarily helpful when somebody takes the time to hear that, which may be like a big time investment upfront, but probably saves a ton of follow-up visits of anxiety, just knowing someone has all of the information. And again, in that open-ended tell me your story, I think you get stuff that the person didn't necessarily even know was part of the story that may be really pertinent. I think curiosity, I think being spoken to like an ally and an adult is so huge. Again, like I feel like the people I know who've come away most anxious have been people who have been, given a kind of brick wall. And I think even if there's some sense that they've been heard or some frustration has been shared at the limits of what can be done, is so enormous. Yeah, I do think the meditation stuff, if you have something that isn't clear and there's no clear result in mind, is amazing. I've also found, having come from the land of self-care and listen to your body and go easy on yourself, which I think is so important for those type A's out there, but perhaps not as important for someone like me who when I listen to my body tells me to go lie in bed and look at Instagram. Like that's not, I'm someone who should listen less to their body actually. So I think there's also a sense in which there's the idea that somebody might believe that you can do something that you don't believe you can do. I think that's so delicate as a doctor because you don't want to seem dismissive and like you're pushing someone. But I do think that one of the key people who helped me with my concussion treated me kind of like a sports coach, kind of like, I know you can do this. Like, I know you can, and there was a kind of confidence in me that I didn't have, that I physically could do a lot of things that I wasn't doing, that I was sort of freezing and turtling away from the world and convinced of my own limitations. To have someone say like, why don't we just play with those a little? Let's just see what happens if you are more physically active, if you do things that bug your brain a little bit more. So I found that really helpful too, is like gauging that with me, what I didn't need was more listening to my body. What I needed actually was more faith that I had resilience.
Yeah, and of course, that's where the title of your book comes from, this notion of running towards the danger, which resonates across so many of the essays and so much of life as a human. But I think that this concept of for some people, the notion of listening and slowing down and really being aware can be extremely powerful. I mean, I think it's powerful for most people to a certain extent. But one of the things in family medicine is, as we know our patients so well over time, hopefully we can begin to ascertain who that's super helpful for and where it's actually presenting a barrier to a person feeling confident that they can get better. And I think about the parallel to the quantified self. For some people, counting their steps and their calories is very empowering and helps them to understand that they have control over their body and their life, and they can make active choices about their health. And for other people, it sends them into a horrible spiral of anxiety and self-judgment. And so the same intervention can have very different effects depending on a person's frame of mind or on their sort of psychological makeup.
And how do you make that call? Like, what are the things that you look for? Like with that example is a great example, but what do you do in the little time you have with someone to ascertain whether something will be helpful or harmful?
Well, I'd turn to all my colleague family doctors. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I'll say in my own personal life and practice, I think it is that curiosity that you spoke about. So a person can be trying something and just a question about like, what's that like for you? An open-ended, then it's an invitation to tell me, well, how are you finding this? And if the person says, well, I've been doing the meditation and the yoga or whatever, and I'm really noticing, like, I never knew my left hip was hurting. Now my left hip is hurting and my right shoulder is hurting and my whatever. And you just think to yourself, this is not having the desired impact, or checking those numbers, judging oneself when the numbers don't come out right, or and so just trying to take that curious stance. I mean, that is one of the, and as we come to know our patients over time, I think many of us might have the hubris to say we sometimes think we kind of know who that's gonna be useful for and who should stay away from it. And so, and of course, also we're often wrong, and nevertheless, I think you come to know for which kinds of people and personalities You might make the bold assertion that maybe you need to listen a little less to your body and have faith that you can push forward, and for whom that would be a dangerous thing to say. I want to transition to Sarah Polley as activist and advocate, because of course you're much more than a filmmaker and an author and an artist. You're also a politically engaged person. And yes, and I'll invite everyone to start thinking about what questions you have for Sarah and put them into the Q&A, and we'll come to those shortly. Just as a small example, you recently endorsed Olivia Chow for mayor of the city of Toronto, and for a person who's got your profile and sort of personal star power, that's a really important endorsement for Olivia. But you do tell the story in your book about a decision that you made not to be an activist in that way, and that relates to your experience of being assaulted by Jian Ghomeshi and the decision process that you went through that led to your decision not to come forward. And so as a person who thinks a lot about advocacy in medicine, and in our discipline, we're increasingly talking about advocacy as a legitimate part of what it means to be a doctor, and that advocating not just for individuals, but for the conditions that create health is an important part of what we do. But no one can fight every battle every time. And you can't, the expression goes, you can't die on every hill. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you have made and navigated decisions about when to use your power to try to advance the social causes that you care about, and when to be a little bit more self-protective, as you did in the case of your experience of assault.
Thank you. Yeah, it's something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think for me, I have kind of a few steps I go through when I decide whether or not I'm going to be publicly supportive of something or an activist on a certain issue. The first one is usefulness. Will I be useful? So in the case of coming forward in the Ghomeshi trial at that time, I'd probably met with 10 lawyers to find out whether my case would help lend legitimacy to the other women who came forward. And the answer was pretty uniformly no. I think now post Me Too and post a lot of changes in the way these cases are heard, and expert witnesses who are now brought into the process to talk about the role of trauma in terms of how things are remembered and post-assault behavior, and how confusing that can look from the outside. It's possible I would be useful now if that happened. At the time, it would not have been technically useful in a legal way for them, and it wouldn't have lent legitimacy to their cases. So the usefulness question was answered quite quickly. And then the second one, I think, is resilience. And am I resilient enough at this moment to take this on? And then I've sort of extended, and at that time, the answer was no. I had a newborn and a toddler. Then I think the question for me is, what would it take for me to become resilient enough so that next time something like this comes around, and I would like to be sturdy enough that I could take a lot of hits for something, or fight a lot of battles, what would it take for me to be more resilient next time? And I think that's a really useful question for everybody to ask themselves, is how resilient do we feel? What would it take for us in terms of our lives and how we're living them to feel more resilient, so that if this rolls around again, I could. And really my idea with the Ghomeshi thing was, I can't do something now, both because of usefulness and my resilience, but I'm going to do something at some point. So I wrote that essay at a time where I felt it would be useful in terms of the conversation about what does it look like for women who decide not to come forward, because the vast majority of cases, we all know, people don't come forward. So we don't hear those stories because they don't come forward. So that I thought would be a contribution I could make in the conversation. And I felt resilient enough at that moment in my life to do so. So I like to think about it that way, that is it useful? Am I resilient enough? If not, how can I change that? So next time this rolls around that something's really important to me, I have the energy for it. And also to not underestimate how much energy I think can come from engaging and putting yourself out into the world in terms of community, and feeling like you're extending yourself for something that benefits not just yourself, I think is underestimated. I think we tend to think of refueling as this very private, quiet enterprise. And I think for some people it is, but I think people are often surprised how much energy they get for whatever else is overwhelming from being in community and from finding ways forward.
That's really helpful. And I think it's also a fair balance, assess your environment and the impact you can have, and then assess yourself. It's that age-old thing of look to your own safety before you run into a burning building, and that's what allows us to be resilient also for the next ask, because there will be more asks, more opportunities to engage. In fact, endless opportunities as we all try to make the world a better place. So we've got a lot of wonderful questions in the Q&A, and I invite people to upvote those that they think are that they'd most like to hear Sarah answer. But I'm gonna pick one out here. As family physicians, we often suffer from imposter syndrome. As a much celebrated actor, writer, and filmmaker, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? What pearls do you have for us about that?
Question. So yes, I absolutely deal with imposter syndrome always. And I think that the thing that I've realized really recently is that everyone does, unless there's something not quite right. Like, I think it's a really healthy thing to feel, but I think it's also really helpful to know that I think anybody who's trying to improve at what they do and get better and still always feels like they're kind of at the very beginning of learning about their profession. So I definitely feel imposter syndrome constantly, and sometimes it gets the better of me. And I think in those moments, I hopefully try to remind myself that that's how a lot of my favorite filmmakers also feel.
Thank you. So we have a guest who has asked, how has your experience overcoming post-concussion syndrome changed you personally and professionally?
It's completely changed me. I think a lot of what I had to personally do to move past all of those symptoms was to do more of the things that were causing me discomfort. And this is obviously not for everybody, as you know. This is like my case specifically. So I just had to, literally run towards the danger. So anything I was afraid of, anything that I thought was going to trigger more symptoms, I had to do more of, whether that be going to grocery shop or to a party or to have a lot of social interaction or to do a ton of physical activity when I had a headache. But I think that became a paradigm shift for me in my life, where now something being uncomfortable doesn't necessarily create an automatic feeling of aversion in me. I mean, it does, but I look at it and then wonder if I should keep going anyway. It's not for me. Anxiety is no longer a stop sign. It's not an instruction manual. It's a feeling that comes up that I may just choose to do the thing and walk alongside anyway. And that's not who I was before. It's sort of who I had to become to get through my concussion symptoms, but it's sort of become who I am normally, because that practice of having to do that for months and months and then seeing such a tangible result where I did get back to 100% when I really wasn't able to work or care for my kids properly for years. It sort of becomes, I'm a bit evangelical in the book about my specific concussion treatment. I recognize that, but it was for me such a paradigm shift.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. And I was thinking as I was reading it about the avalanche of post-COVID, long COVID symptoms and post-COVID syndrome that we're going to be helping our patients to deal with over the months and years to come. And whether for some patients and some of the time, some of what you articulate in the book, you just did it so beautifully when you said, the symptoms or the anxiety isn't a stop sign necessarily. That you have to notice it, interrogate it, and then make a decision sometimes that you're actually going to push through it. And that may work for some people some of the time. There's I think, a wisdom in that we all might reflect on as we think about our patients with long COVID who are struggling in similar kinds of ways.
I've wondered this so much, just with no medical knowledge at all, just wondered so much about how much of the advice for long COVID mirrors the concussion advice I was beginning to get that really was not helpful for me. And I think it's so hard because I do think anxiety and symptoms can become best friends, and they start talking to each other and moving alongside each other, and which is which, and that's so hard to untangle. I will say it's so delicate the way you tell someone to push themselves, right? Like
Mhm.
I was told to push myself, by people in my life, and felt it as judgment and a lack of a sort of sense that I was somehow exaggerating or making it up, and it was really harmful and pushed me further back. But then it's like in the right tone, in the right moment, delivered exactly the right way, that kind of I'm a sports coach and I'm on your side can be incredible. But if it's delivered with any sense of not believing or judgment, it does the opposite. So I don't know. Again, I don't know how you guys figure this out within 5 to 7 minutes of seeing a patient. It must be such a trick.
Yeah, and sometimes I'll say it lands wrong the first time, but then the person comes back, and says, "I thought about what you said, and my reaction to it, and actually you had a point, but I couldn't hear it that time." And so either the way that you said it or the way that I heard it didn't land, but now actually I'm reflecting on it and heard it. And so that's the thing about relationship is it might be a short interaction, but we have many of them over time, and sometimes there can be repair. A great question from David White that's been upvoted. Women Talking has an amazing ensemble cast. Did your reputation for unconditional positive regard draw people to work with you as a director?
Can you just say the last part of it again?
Did your reputation for unconditional positive regard draw people to work with you as a director? Like, are you doing something that makes people want to work with you? Does your reputation, does this unconditional positive regard approach make you a magnet for the incredible people in that film and others that you've been lucky to work with?
I think that it was, I think recently that I sort of adopted this as more of a public thing that I kind of talk about and that I kind of operationalize on a set. I mean, I think that was generally my sense, having grown up as a kid on set and feeling very vulnerable and feeling that people's well-being were not always placed in the priority that it should be. So I think it was always instinctually I went that way, but I didn't really have and I think it does really help to have an organizing principle, when you're managing that many people in that chaotic and high pressure environment. So I think I wouldn't have identified it as that until really recently and had the language for it. But I do think people did experience it positively. And again, I also think we have to be easy on ourselves that we can't do it 800% of the time. I mean, there's going to be a moment where your unconditional positive regard, you suddenly a habitual pattern comes up and you're actually, you do feel judgments slip in. That's human. But I think that just as the overall aim has been really helpful. And I did feel like what was really nice for me was the younger actors on our film, like 2 young women, talk a lot about what they wouldn't put up with now on a set going forward. And that made me really happy because I thought that's an impact I'd like to have of people actually going this is how I expect to be treated. And there's so many crossing of lines and things that are acceptable that shouldn't be acceptable on film sets. And so it made me happy they were going into the world feeling that way, at least.
Well, and that links to another question, which we haven't talked about yet, is your experiences as a child actor, which you detail in your book. And so our guest says that they think about your comments about child actors and children working often. As high achievers ourselves, I'm assuming physicians, we are often tempted to push our own children to the maximum. Competitive sport, acting, competitive dance, etc. What advice do you share with other parents about protecting children from adult type work?
Yeah, I mean, you get one childhood, you get one short period of your life to not have those kinds of pressures. So there are kids who thrive in those kinds of pressures and want to be in those kinds of environments. I think if it's completely kid initiated, and I don't mean kid initiated by a kid expressed a classic interest in something once and then you got way more excited about it than they are. I think, but if it really is child directed and child centered, it's possible there's a place for that. But I think there's almost always an activity that would run alongside that activity that would be more child-centered and less competitive that might be an option. I'm always curious, with the child actors that I meet, and I still meet many of them who have parents who are really living their dreams through their kids, and kids who are, rarely in school, who are very tired, who have been working long hours or being out late at entertainment industry parties, and who are not getting the kind of social life I think they probably should be at that age. I'm always curious about their meetings with their family doctors. Like, is anybody picking up on this? Is anyone having a conversation with mom? Because I think in general, any kid in a professional environment, I think it requires some analysis and some really serious questions, and just sort of outlining what, the issues might be with that, later in life, to have missed out on a huge section of life where things might be a little less pressurized if you're lucky and have an okay childhood. But also just, what does it mean to miss the socialization of school, and to, be working odd hours, and to have a more kind of unstable life? If it's, in the realm of possibility to create one, what does that mean? So I have always wondered, with especially some of the kids I'm thinking of right now, I'm like, does the family doctor like do anything more than great to see you in that TV show the other day? Which is, I think, what certainly my family doctors when I was a kid was doing with me, there was a lot of like, that's could only possibly be a net good because there was success involved.
Yeah, really important. And the family is a web, and we are trained to observe not just individuals, but the way that they interact with each other. And so I think you're right. We need to inquire about that. Brent Elsie asks a question about teams and the notion of unconditional positive regard. We've heard some comments in the chat about this as well, that it was so it's so cool and impressive that you hired a psychologist to take care of your cast and crew, as we think about not just that we can do our best work together for our patients, or making a film or whatever the work is, if we're taking good care of each other, and if people feel safe themselves. And do you have any advice for how to build a team where people are practicing unconditional positive regard with each other and feeling safe with each other so they can do their best work?
I mean, I tend to sort of end up getting involved in stuff in a way that isn't always fun and can be thankless, and sometimes also cannot be helpful. But I tend to sort of like take on tensions that develop in a work environment that don't have to do with me, and just see what I can do. Do you know what I mean? Which isn't to say like you come in and be like some obnoxious adult figure, like, these are adults you're working with. But I do think the idea of creating environments, I can think of one thing where because we were all masked inside all the time, like we just had to go outside for 20 minutes a day and see each other's faces and talk, was a really big deal. Because I think when you're working with a mask all day, you think you're getting what's happening with somebody and you actually don't. You're not seeing like huge upsets building. You're not seeing anxiety in the same way. You're not reading tone of voice. So I think having a dedicated time to see each other's faces and talk casually for 20 minutes a day made a huge difference for us in terms of some things that we're building between people. But yeah, I think also just making it something that you actually care about, and being clear that you care about that. And it's not always going to be the most fun role to play, but I do kind of think like taking responsibility for having a happy work environment, even beyond what you're doing or not doing, is really important.
Yeah, and I do think that we talk a lot about the importance of taking care of our patients, and we even now talk a lot about the importance of taking care of ourselves. I'm not sure that we talk enough about the importance of taking care of each other, and I think that that's an important lesson that I'm learning from talking to you. So Shelby asks a question, a two-part question, and I might paraphrase it a bit, Shelby, I hope you don't mind, around advocacy and the experiences of women or people who've been assaulted, and survivors who are coming forward, and the role of family doctors. So, because of course, the notion of being supportive of survivors of assault, of believing them, of being open and empathic towards them is so critical. And the family doctor's office is one place where people will disclose their experiences of abuse, whether recent or remote. Do you because you spent a lot of time talking to these women and dealing with your own experiences, do you have suggestions or pearls for us about how to help survivors who are coming forward, what you have heard about people's good experiences of feeling supported coming forward, and any views about what family doctors could be doing at that system level to advocate for a justice system that would not drag people through what women are dragged through?
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. I wish I had more time and Lori Haskell beside me here to help answer it, because I'm not going to give an adequate answer for sure, but it's an amazing question. I would just say, my instinctual response would be, with any difficult conversation, and especially anything that's being talked about for the first time, the notion that this is an ongoing conversation that we can return to is huge, so that people sort of don't walk away thinking, okay, I've had that conversation, but I'm still left with all of this stuff, and now this new stuff is coming up, that this can be a continued dialogue, whether that be through, referral to somebody else or through the person that's been disclosed to. I just think people knowing a conversation hasn't ended and can come up at any time is huge. And yeah, I mean, I think that the work of Dr. Lori Haskell's incredible. She's a psychologist who's now sometimes called as an expert witness in these cases, who talks about the impact that sexual assault has on memory and on behavior. And I think just developing an awareness around all the parts of your story that you're embarrassed about or not telling me right now are normal. Like the friendly email you sent afterwards doesn't mean you were not assaulted. The fact that you invited this person out for a date doesn't mean you weren't assaulted. Like, there are a lot of things that people are holding on to that they feel are in opposition with their story of having been assaulted, that it's really helpful to hear that is actually more normal than not. So I think like introducing the space for that part of the story to come out and be embraced as not in conflict with the rest of it, I think would be really helpful. But I'm sure there's great insights that Dr. Lori Haskell would have into this, and I think maybe worth talking to her.
Yeah, and it's such an important thing also, because we all live in a society that socializes us to think those things aren't normal. And so we have to do the work on ourselves as well to notice when we're having those reactions, and communicate with ourselves as well as communicate with our patients that's the case. And so Michelle Homer, building on that, asks a question about creating safe space for dialogue. And maybe this is a question for the documentary filmmaker in you. Do you have openers or questions that you return to because you find that they are generative and make people feel safe when you're broaching a difficult topic? Are there, like in family medicine, we often say, tell me more about that. So there are some kind of key phrases. People can put some of their key phrases into the chat that they like to use, that they find often will help people to crack open those other parts of a story. And let's hear what some of Sarah's might be.
So I begin with, tell me the whole story from beginning to end. Which is exactly what this physician did with my friend the other day. I also use a question that I borrow from my sister's family practice. It's weird, the connection to my sister's family practice. She always says, what else is going on? And I find that really helpful, just to orient me, like what else was going on at the time. Because again, I think you get details that are more central than the person knows. Yeah, those are the two that are, say more is great. And I think those pauses, I do think just letting there be dead space with a curious, open face of unconditional positive regard, I think stuff is just inevitably going to come out. That's really, really important.
Yeah, and that actually links to another question, this thing about tell me the whole story from the beginning. Which has been, which you've suggested more than once, and sounds like a very powerful way to let a person kind of share their narrative. But as one of our attendees points out, people often complain to us that they are told they have to tell their story over and over again. And we also get feedback that says, like, didn't you read the chart? And this is the 14th time I've been asked to tell my story, and why can't you people talk to each other? And so have you ever experienced, like, when do you think that can be helpful, or how might you help us to navigate that particular tension?
Well, I think that the thing that this doctor said to my friend, which was so important at the front, was, I've looked at all of your charts, I've read all of the notes, but I'd like to, tell me your story. So that it's not coming from like, I haven't done my work and I'm making you regurgitate the same thing that I should have known before I came into this meeting. It's, this is an opportunity. And I think a lot of people haven't had that chance. Like, they've been through lots of different meetings and there's bits and pieces, but like people can be in a hurry, especially if you had a bunch of ER visits. No one's actually sat down and said, tell me your whole story. They don't have time. So I don't know, that seems to me like it could be a net positive, but it's possible that also there could be the alternative not to say, like, it would be really useful for me to hear your story from beginning to end with relevant and irrelevant details. If that feels too much for you, can you just tell me the bare bones of it? Like, maybe if people are not up for it, but I think generally I would say as a patient, my main concern is taking up too much of a doctor's time. I'm really stressed about it. I know what the limits of the system are right now. I know how many people don't even have family doctors. I'm super stressed about being a demanding, needy patient. So I'm probably going to say quite a bit less than I probably should. Like, I'll remember a whole bunch of things later, but I'm so stressed by what time I'm taking up. And also, people have had enough dismissive experiences over time with doctors that they also don't want to feel like annoying school children. So they're going to like project something, I think, onto a doctor that might not even exist. And I think it takes some work to show people that you are kind of emotionally available, or at least as the container for their story in that moment.
Yeah, that's great. And there are great suggestions in the chat around what has this been like for you. Tell me what you wish doctors had asked you. Lots of great ways to try to get at that storytelling without making people feel as though they're just repeating themselves. Yeah, because I think we've all had to navigate both understanding that people want and need to tell their stories, and also that often they feel that that's all they do is just have to be told they have to tell their story over and over again. So it's an interesting thing.
Tell me what you wish doctors had asked you. It's like,
yeah, great, good one, Aza. I'm going to end with a final question as we head into the summer. The one that has been most upvoted. What are you reading? What do you love to read? We're all looking for things that we can read in the summer, that not just the self-improving kind, but the self-improving kind is good too. What are your recommendations, and that you would love to know that hundreds of family doctors around the world are gonna go and read for their summer reading?
Oh my God. I think there's two, Giving Up the Ghost by Hilary Mantel, which was such an amazing book for me, in terms of detailing her experience with endometriosis and how that diagnosis got missed for so long. And actually led to her becoming a novelist because she couldn't practice as a lawyer. So we got one of the greatest novelists of all time out of her never getting diagnosed, but it's an incredible book. The book that I would read, just if you want to feel filled up and nurtured and inspired, and it's my most read book, I'm going to read it again this summer, would be Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. And I just think it's a beautifully written book, and it's also about a character. It's just about a deeply good person. And it's such a refreshing thing to just read something about a deeply good person. It's sort of exactly what I need right now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And so a huge thank you to you, Sarah Polley. It's been such a rich conversation, and we know how busy you are, and we're so appreciative of the tremendous art that you put out into the world that enriches our lives in so many ways. So thank you. As you can see from the reactions, this has been such a wonderful experience for all of us, and a wonderful way to remember the big world around us, and to re-engage with other parts of ourselves. So mark your calendars, everyone. On September the 29th, Professor Murphy, who is an environment and data justice scholar, does a lot of work in Indigenous data, and is a brilliant leader in our university, is going to be coming to talk to us about the future of data from a more of an equity perspective. Thank you, Sarah Polley. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and happy Friday, everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a really wonderful thing to get to be part of. Thank you.